Chapter 10. Most days, Claudette enjoyed her mid-morning tea on the balcony off her second-floor bedroom that overlooked the rose garden. In the spring, the scent was lovely. Of course, in September, there wasn't much to smell, but she had other things to stimulate her happiness now, like Andre's phone call. She couldn't be more pleased that Andre and Tasha's marriage would not be one of mere convenience, and she knew Maurice would feel the same once he heard the news. The door opened behind her, but she didn't need to look over her shoulder to know it was Maurice. Not only was it standard procedure for him to join her out here, but his cologne with its slight citrus scent gave away his presence. "Good morning, my darling." Maurice bent to kiss Claudette's cheek. She smiled and glanced up at her husband just as he moved to the other side of the small table and claimed the empty chair. The De Laurent men were all devastatingly handsome. Maurice was no exception. Sure, his face was a bit worn, and his hair had long since grayed at the temples, but he still drew the women's eyes. Claudette was not blind to that fact. If he'd ever been unfaithful to her, he was discreet about it. For that, Claudette was thankful. Maurice took the cloth napkin, shook it out, and laid it across his lap. "You seem to be in high spirits this morning." Claudette took the coffee pot, opened it, and smelled the steaming brew to make sure Maurice hadn't coerced the servants to sneak a little Bailey's in the coffee on his behalf. He had done it before. This time she caught nothing but the reek of strong coffee and moved the pot back toward Maurice. After filling his cup, she added a little cream and 1 cube of sugar. Finishing up, she smiled and said, "There's plenty to be pleased with this morning." "Oh?" He picked up his spoon and dipped it into his coffee. Claudette imagined the prospects of good news that must be flowing through his mind. Camille is pregnant. Lacey has agreed to sell the house she inherited in California. Andre has managed to persuade Tasha. Claudette laughed softly to herself. The list of Maurice's wishes could go on and on. She decided to end the suspense. "Andre telephoned last night." Maurice's face brightened. "Tasha agreed to the marriage?" "Better than that." "What could be better?" "Their marriage is real. It's not simply one for convenience's sake." "Well, that is good news. What do you suppose brought this on?" She shook her head. "I haven't a clue. I'm just glad he woke up before she moved on." "Whatever it was, I couldn't be more pleased." "Oh, yes." Claudette tipped her forefinger into the air. "Andre said that she doesn't know about the will's stipulations, and he wants to keep it that way. He doesn't want her thinking he's marrying her for the inheritance." "Good point." Maurice nodded. "I can see why he'd be against her knowing that. But no matter. The marriage is real. The children will all inherit. All is well." "Yes, and I have a million things to do before they arrive." She stood and dropped her napkin onto the remnants of a pastry on her near-empty plate. "Andre said they want the wedding to take place at the end of next week." "Good. The quicker, the better." Maurice looked up. "Are they marrying in the States?" Claudette nodded. "Yes." "Good. The sooner they're legally wed, somewhere, the better." Claudette sashayed around the table and gave Maurice a light kiss on the lips. "I'll see you later, darling." Maurice watched Claudette disappear inside the house, patting the small flask in his jacket pocket. Once he was sure she was out of sight, he pulled it from his pocket, unscrewed the cap, and spiked his coffee with a liberal shot. With a chuckle, he replaced the cap and slipped the flask back into his pocket. He raised his cup to an imaginary salute and smiled. The Baileys not only improved the coffee's taste, but it allowed him to pose a clandestine toast to his victory. "Yes," Maurice said, just above a whisper. "Andre will marry. He will inherit, right along with Julien and Lacey." Maurice glanced upward. "See, Edouard, I told you it would work out, just as I planned." Chapter 11. The doorbell rang. Tasha rose, straightening her skirt. Andre scooted to the edge of the couch and laid a gentle hand on her arm. Mon trésor, I pay Simon a great deal of money to answer the door. Tasha glanced down at Andre.
I'm sure it's my parents. I think I should be the first person they see.
Very well. Andre caved with a smile and a slight nod. He watched Tasha head for the door, and anxiety began to consume him. Of course, her parents liked him, but would they be so magnanimous once they found out what he had done to their daughter? He was marrying her, though. That had to count for something. Then again, he was also taking her to France, thousands of miles away, not to mention across a very large ocean. Andre didn't see Tasha's parents being happy about that. The good news was that he could offer to bring them over any time they wanted to visit. Andre stood when Jim and Nola Gordon stepped inside the suite. Extending his hand, he moved toward them and shook the man's hand. Jim, it's nice to see you again. Always a pleasure, Andre. Jim looked down at his own attire. You'll have to excuse the way I'm dressed. I was out meeting with a few colleagues. Jim took a swing with an imaginary golf club. Then he and Andre both chuckled. Jim and Nola claimed one of the two couches in the suite's main room, while Andre snuggled close to Tasha on the sofa opposite them.
How long will you two be in Tahoe?
Nola asked. We're leaving early this evening, Andre replied. A short trip, then. Jim Gordon pretzeled his arms over his chest. It's too bad you have to leave so soon. I'm sure Nola could have whipped up something marvelous for dinner. Next time. Andre felt Tasha stiffen and cuddled her closer to him. Would you like to tell them, mon trésor? He whispered the words against her ear. Or shall I?
I will,
she said with far less confidence than she typically had. She sucked in a breath and blew it out between her closed lips.
Mom, Dad, Andre and I are getting married.
Married? Jim repeated in a crumbling voice. His gaze drifted from Tasha to Andre and back to Tasha again. I had no idea you two were that serious.
Well, I think it's wonderful.
Nola beamed with pride.
I couldn't be more pleased.
Huh? That was the last thing Tasha expected to hear from Nola Gordon, the consummate stage mother.
Will you be getting married here in the States or France?
Nola took over the conversation, effectively cutting off Tasha's father.
Both, actually,
Tasha said. Her father went stone-faced and cleared his throat. No matter what she said from here on out, she doubted her father would be happy. But it mattered little. She and Andre were getting married. She was pregnant. Once she revealed that, then and only then would her father jump reluctantly on board.
Mom, Dad, we're getting married this afternoon.
What? Her father's objection was clear in his tone. Andre withdrew his arm from around Tasha's shoulder and scooted to the edge of the couch. Mr. Gordon, Jim, I love Tasha very much, and I promise you that I will always take care of her. My only goal in life will be her happiness. Of that I have no doubt. Her father had plastered on his poker face, but Tasha knew inside he was steaming. But I can't help but wonder if you two should take a little more time to consider this.
We can't, Daddy.
Tasha dropped her gaze to her lap. And why not?
Because...
Tasha paused and pushed her gaze to Andre.
We're gonna have a baby.
Normally, being stuck in the back room of a hotel suite, alone with her mother, would set Tasha on a track that led to the far side of distress. But today, the day she would become Mrs. Andre de Laurent, Tasha found her mother's presence somehow comforting. Nola Gordon wasn't doing anything particularly useful other than sitting on the edge of the bed while Tasha touched up her makeup. But seeing her mother's reflection in the mirror gave her some peace. Maybe it was the approval thing. All her life, Tasha had wanted nothing more than her mother's approval, for her mother to be proud of her.
Mom, please say you're happy for me, that you're not disappointed, even if you don't mean it.
Tasha held the eyeshadow brush next to her face while looking at her mother's reflection in the mirror.
Tasha, of course I'm happy for you.
Nola beamed with a bright-eyed smile. Tasha thought her mother might be about to burst.
You've really hit the jackpot with Andre.
While she had hoped her mother would add something like, Andre is a wonderful man and very deserving of my little girl, but Tasha knew that was more likely to have been something her father would have said. Nevertheless, Tasha was happy, and she was determined to not let her mother's lack of pride in her spoil the day. Tasha finished her eye makeup, and as she swabbed on some blush, she said,
I just didn't know if you'd think I was giving up on acting to marry Andre and be disappointed in me.
Nola pushed herself up from the bed and latched onto Tasha with a boisterous hug.
Honey, you've landed the biggest role of your life, and I'm banking that everything I've taught you will help you turn in an Oscar-worthy performance.
God, Mom, this isn't an act. This is my life. Your grandchild's life that we're talking about. Tasha reminded herself that she had silently vowed not to do or say anything to offset the balance of this day, a day that she was determined to remember as perfect. She sucked in a deep and hopefully cleansing breath, looked up at her mother, and smiled.
I'm glad that we're in agreement. Marrying Andre is the right thing for me to do.
And more than that, Nola's biting tone ripped through Tasha. See to it that you don't do anything to muck it up. A quiet breeze drifted past Nola Gordon as she and her husband stood at the entrance of the Shoreline Hotel with their daughter and her new husband. The ceremony had been quick but legal. Nola couldn't have been prouder of her new son-in-law. A limo pulled up to the curb, stopping in front of the party. It would transport Andre and Tasha to the airport for the lengthy flight to Marseille, France, Tasha's new home. Tasha hugged Jim first.
Daddy, I'm so glad you and Mom could come today.
We wouldn't have had it any other way. He smiled at Tasha. As Tasha moved toward Nola, Andre offered his hand to Jim.
I'm eternally grateful that you and Mrs. Gordon could come out today. It means as much to me as it does Tasha.
The pleasure was ours, Andre. Jim gave him an approving nod. I trust you'll take excellent care of my daughter. A nervous chuckle reverberated from Tasha as she reached for her mother. Nola pulled Tasha to her and hugged her tightly.
Mother, I'm so glad you and Daddy were with me today.
Tasha embraced her a little tighter than usual, which surprised Nola. Tasha kept her arms entwined loosely around her.
Promise me you'll come to France when the baby's due?
Tasha. Nola hugged her again.
Of course I want to be there for the last weeks of your pregnancy and the first weeks of my new grandchild's life. Anytime you want to come over.
Tasha paused to glance at Andre, then asked,
You will send a plane for them, won't you?
Of course we will.
Andre stroked Tasha's arm lovingly.
In fact, we'll send a jet for them later next week for the wedding in France.
Excitement stirred in Nola's stomach as she shared a quick glance with Jim. His slight nod indicated he understood that she wanted to go.
I'll make time for it.
Jim looked at Andre. Just let us know the flight details.
Well done.
Andre shook Jim's hand and then turned to Nola.
Thank you.
He kissed her cheek. No explanations were necessary. Nola knew Andre was thanking her for Tasha.
You take good care of my little girl, Andre.
Nola smiled, consumed with pride.
You can count on it,
Andre said as the driver opened the door. He smiled, guided Tasha into the car, then offered one last wave before disappearing inside with her. The driver shut the door, trotted around to his side, and jumped in. Seconds later, the brake lights flickered and the car rolled out into the Tahoe traffic. Pride swelled around Nola's heart and nearly pushed the tears past her eyes. She had done well. Her little girl was marrying the handsomest, richest man of Nola's acquaintance, or anyone else she knew for that matter. Yes, there was much to brag about at the next Tahoe Women's Club meeting. Several minutes passed before Jim touched her elbow. "Are you ready to go, hon?"
Not quite yet.
Nola's eyes were still glued to the road, in the direction where Tasha and Andre's limo had long since disappeared.
Just one more minute.
"I'll get the car. You wait here." Nola barely noticed Jim leaving. Instead, she wanted to savor the feeling of accomplishment that had washed over her today. Nothing in Nola's life to come would ever top this. Moments later, a man stepped up beside Nola, but she barely noticed him. She was too busy reveling in her good fortune. Nola would now be the envy of all she knew. "Pardon me." The friendly greeting came in the form of a foreign accent. British. Nola cut her eyes toward him. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was rocking back and forth on his heels. Most people wouldn't know his suit was an Armani knockoff, but she knew. Nola Gordon knew her fashion. Oblivious of her insight, he shrugged and shook his head. "Valet must be backed up." Nola narrowed her eyes. A cool September breeze blew her hair in her face. "Parking," he said. "I noticed you've been standing here for a while now."
No.
Nola raked her hair back, away from her face.
My husband is bringing the car around. We were seeing my daughter off. She just left with her husband. They're flying back to France tonight. That's where they live.
Nola was all too happy to brag about Tasha's fortunate situation. "So your daughter lives in France, eh? Lovely country." He tipped his head to one side.
Yes,
Nola said.
her husband is from there. We don't get over there much, but I'm sure that now that they're having a baby, we will go over for an extended stay.
"Oh, a baby. You don't say." He pulled a hand from his pocket and offered it to Nola. "Congratulations." They shook hands. "But if you don't mind my saying so, you don't look old enough to be a grandmother." Nola felt a surge of blood rush to her cheeks. It had been a long time since anyone, a man, had complimented her. Peter Whitmire thought he had run up against a brick wall when he arrived in South Lake Tahoe, only to find out that Andre De Laurent and his American squeeze had just left. But then he had the good fortune of running into Tasha Gordon's mother outside the Shoreline's entrance. That woman hadn't been just a stream of information, she was a whole fountain. Thanks to her, he now knew that his client's worst fears had happened. Andre De Laurent had found himself a wife, and not only that, she was pregnant. This wouldn't bode well for Cecily Garceau Mason and her brother. It would, in fact, drive a stake through the heart of Cecily's chances at disqualifying the De Laurent fellow from the will. Peter had better make sure he received another payment from Ms. Mason before he turned over this new and damaging information. Chapter 12. The flight to France had been an uneventful one. Tasha had slept on and off, but it had been restless sleep. When they arrived at the chateau, Andre insisted that Tasha take a short nap before dinner. This would give him time to talk to Papa and let him know about the surprise announcement he intended to make over dinner. After seeing Tasha tucked into bed, Andre kissed her, turned the lights down, and bid her adieu. Expecting to find Papa in his study, Andre was a little more than surprised when he found the room empty. He traversed the hallways in search of his father, and the house seemed eerily quiet. "Where is everyone?" he asked no one in particular as he approached the east salon, where he found Claudette. Upon seeing him, Claudette smiled. She laid the book she was reading on the table at her side and pushed up from her chair. "Andre!" She pulled him to her, giving him a mother's hug. "I'm so glad you're back." She put enough space between them to gaze upon his face. "Where's Tasha? She is with you, right?" "Yes," Andre nodded. "She's a bit tired from the trip. She's resting before dinner." "Ah, wonderful." Claudette stepped back.
I'll have the arrangements for the wedding wrapped up early next week. Everything will go as planned next Saturday.
You are good. Andre gave her a small, triumphant chuckle.
Which, I presume, is why you turned to me?
Precisely. Andre cleared his throat and looked around.
Where is Papa? I wanted to talk to him. Don't worry. I've already spoken to him. He will not divulge your secret.
For a second, Andre wondered if he had told Claudette about the baby, but remembered he hadn't. She must be talking about the will's stipulations.
Thank you.
Andre gave her a smile before backing out of the room. It was better that he continued to search for Papa himself. It wouldn't pay for Claudette to get hold of the idea that Papa might learn a secret before she did.
Andre,
she stepped out into the hallway after him.
Your father's not here. He'll be home in time for dinner.
Ah. Andre nodded his head, trying to contain his disappointment. He wanted to tell Papa before he shared the news with the rest of the family.
I'll catch up with him later.
Maybe he'd get a few minutes with Papa before dinner. A soft rapping on the door aroused Tasha from her slumber.
Damn,
she thought as she crawled out of her sleep-induced stupor.
Yes?
She started to sit up, made it halfway before deciding it wasn't worth it, and fell back into bed. The door opened. Tasha hoped it was Andre or maybe Camille. She couldn't bear to face the barrage of questions from anyone else right now.
It's me.
Camille peeked inside.
Can I come in? Are you sleeping?
Her voice had risen with the last inquiry.
No, just resting.
Tasha shrugged and shook her head.
Jet lag.
She waved Camille in.
You know how that is.
Camille entered, shut the door behind her, and hurried across the room. She bounced onto Tasha's bed and the girls hugged. Tasha moved over, giving Camille more room.
I love your hair.
Tasha checked out Camille's new do, touching the ends of her blonde hair with her palm. The multi-layered ringlets bounced against Tasha's hand.
I can't believe how long it's gotten. I wasn't too sure about it at first.
She shrugged.
I'm getting used to it now.
A wide smile spread across Camille's face.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. For good. Knowing you're here made it a lot easier to come, I'll tell you that.
Tasha laughed, trying to disguise the fear that wouldn't go away.
Maurice is a scary idea for a father-in-law.
Both women laughed. Camille shook her head.
But he likes you. He likes you, too. Now.
Camille added such emphasis to the word that Tasha couldn't help noting its importance.
At least he won't be throwing a better-suited prospective bride at Andre. It's too late anyway.
Tasha smiled.
Andre and I got married before we left the States. The wedding here in France for the family takes place at the end of next week. A wise decision.
Camille nodded.
Although not quite as necessary as it was for me. Better safe than sorry, right?
Amusement played on the edge of Tasha's voice. Camille looked at Tasha for a long while before saying anything else.
Are you okay?
She asked.
You seem a little out of sorts. That obvious, huh?
Tasha sucked in a deep breath.
What's going on? Does no one, not even you, wonder why Andre and I all of a sudden decided to get married?
We married a couple of brothers who aren't used to doing things the conventional way, Camille said with a shrug.
I'm pregnant.
Camille's eyebrows shot up.
Really?
Tasha nodded.
How far along are you? A few weeks, a couple of months or so. Wow!
Camille giggled like a schoolgirl.
It's not that funny.
Tasha's voice grew serious.
I can hear it now. The big question for the next 7 months will be, is it really Andre's baby? No.
Camille shook her head.
The big question will be, whose baby will be born first?
Another baby? Someone else in the family was having a baby? Certainly not Claudette. Hopefully not Lacey. Camille? Hope sprouted on the edge of Tasha's heart.
You're pregnant?
Camille nodded. Tasha glanced at Camille's tummy. Flat. She couldn't be much farther along than Tasha.
I'm due in early April,
Camille said.
Me too.
Tasha sat up in bed and hugged Camille.
Congratulations.
Camille hugged her back.
Right back at you.
She looked at Tasha.
But please don't tell Andre. Julian wants to tell the family tonight at dinner. I won't say a word if you don't,
Tasha bargained. Camille nodded.
We'll let our respective husbands have that pleasure.
Andre hadn't deluded himself that there wouldn't be times when he'd feel guilty about hiding the terms of the will from Tasha, especially times like this when she reached for his hand as they were about to enter the dining room, where he knew she felt she'd face a barrage of questions from the family. Telling Tasha the truth, that everyone wanted them to wed, would have rested her fears, but that could have led to a whole new set of problems. Problems far worse than the temporary ones she faced now. Problems that could build a wedge between them that'd last forever. Besides, Tasha's doubts would disappear once she saw how excited everyone was about her joining the family. Better to let it play out this way. The alternative, telling her about the will requiring him to marry, would only add stress upon her that would linger and linger and linger. And that couldn't be good for the baby. Crossing the room's threshold, Andre released Tasha's hand and wrapped his arm around her, pulling her protectively close. Of course, there was nothing to protect her from, except the details of Edouard Renault's will. Claudette and Lacey were the first to their feet. Both women hovered around the couple. Each greeted Tasha with a friendly hug. Soon all three women were hugging and laughing, and Tasha looked like she was actually relaxing a little.
Come sit by me.
Camille patted the empty chair to her left.
Of course she'll sit by you.
Claudette led Tasha around the table and deposited her in the seat next to Camille. Andre slid Tasha's chair in, then sat in the empty one to her left. Settling in, he cut his eyes stealthily toward Papa, who was grinning. Andre suspected that Papa's smile had a little something to do with him. After all, Andre had managed to secure this multi-billion euros fortune as long as he could hold on to his wife for the next 364 days.
Tasha,
Maurice spoke.
I can't tell you how pleased I am to hear that you're my new daughter-in-law.
Thank you, Maurice,
she said with a gentle smile.
I couldn't have asked for a more loving family to marry into.
That statement had more generosity than truth to it, but Andre knew that he, Julian, and Lacey would, thanks in part to Claudette, break the cycle of hands-off love that had been handed down from generation to generation in the De Laurent family. Once the staff brought in hot lentil soup, a wave of calm swooped down over Andre. Proper etiquette, which was always observed at Pacifique des Lumières, would steer the family toward eating and the conversation to nothing more than polite chit-chat. That is, until after the main course. That's when the mood would relax around the table, and if anyone had any announcements, then and only then was the time for disclosure. Andre was glad when Tasha dipped her spoon into the soup, tasted it, then went back for more. She ate nearly half before pushing it aside. When the next course was served, typically a garden salad of some sort, she was having none of it, which didn't surprise Andre. She'd made it clear more than once that she hated any kind of lettuce. But instead of complaining, Tasha sat quietly as Claudette and Lacey chatted about the plans they'd already arranged for the wedding coming up next week. Tasha listened, tilting her head their way every so often, as if the wedding being discussed was not hers but someone else's. Andre's stepmother and his sister scarcely stopped to draw breath as the main course was served. Tasha devoured the roast beef and au gratin potatoes, picked through the vegetables, mainly eating the yellow and green squash, leaving the peppers pushed to one side on her plate. Every so often, Camille would snag a pepper from the discarded food on Tasha's plate. Normally that would have driven Papa nuts, but now he hardly seemed to notice. Andre glanced around the table, checking everyone's plate, examining how close they were to finishing. Funny, now that the time had come, he felt a measure of anxiety stirring in his abdomen. He gave his stomach a gentle rub, wondering if Tasha was feeling okay. Andre had a great deal of anticipation building inside. He'd have to admit that he held a certain sense of perverse pleasure in knowing he'd gotten out of the gate before Julian, who'd been married an entire year. Big Brother was not going to like this. He wouldn't take it lightly being shown up by Andre, but he would have to live with it, and that made Andre chuckle a little, if only to himself. Andre, so wrapped in his thoughts, hadn't really noticed Julian tossing his napkin onto his plate and pushing his chair back as he stood. Julian placed his hand on Camille's shoulder, winked at her, and then turned his attention to the rest of the family. What is he doing? Andre fidgeted in his chair, wanting Julian to hurry up and sit back down. He had more important things to share. First, Julian glanced past Camille, setting his sights on Tasha. Let me officially welcome Camille's best friend Tasha to the family. He reached for his glass of wine. From the moment I met you, I knew you'd steal my little brother's heart. He lifted the glass toward Andre and Tasha. I couldn't think of a better person for the task. He nodded. Because I know you'll cherish it. Julian's gaze traveled around the table as he said, To Andre and Tasha. A myriad of voices repeated the toast, and then everyone began drinking from their glasses. Not everyone's glass was filled with wine like Julian's. Andre and Claudette were the only other people at the table with a glass of wine for dinner. Lacey was too young. Maurice didn't dare, not in front of Claudette, and water had been requested for Tasha and Camille. Andre set his glass down and took one last glance at Julian, eager for him to sit so Andre could share his and Tasha's good news. But Julian didn't sit down. He remained standing over Camille, his wine glass still in hand. Now, once again, Julian looked at his wife, and this time he smiled. Not that I want to steal your thunder or anything. He looked at Andre. But Camille and I have an announcement of some importance. As do I. Andre sucked in a deep breath to squelch his impatience. So get to it. I'm pleased to announce, Julian's attention was back on Camille now, that my lovely wife is pregnant. Andre should have known Julian would find a way to eclipse him. But all was not lost. He'd wait until he found out when Camille was due before falling back into second position again. His luck couldn't be that bad, could it? Just once he wanted to do something before Julian. Competition was in their nature, and until now Julian had held the grand prize, De Laurent Enterprises. Siring the first grandchild was all Andre had, and now Julian threatened to take that away from him too. Perhaps Tasha could find out from Camille when she was due. After the revelry over Julian and Camille's good fortune died down and the family dispersed from the dinner table, Tasha and Andre headed into the hallway. As they walked, she leaned against Andre and whispered, "Let's have some tea out in the rose garden." "All right." Andre nodded. "It sounds like a wonderful idea." "Are you disappointed?" she asked, but didn't say about what. "I'm the happiest man around. Why would you think I'd be disappointed over anything, "I know you wanted to tell everyone about our baby at dinner tonight," she said. "But it seems Julian beat you to the punch." "I'll tell them later." He shrugged. "All that matters now is you, me, and our baby." "I'm very excited." "About the wedding next week?" he guessed. "We'll be going on a short honeymoon. We have a little villa in Saint-Tropez. It's right on the ocean. You'll love it. When we come back, after we've seen the doctor and he gives us permission, we'll take a cruise of the Greek Isles or wherever you wish to go." "Saint-Tropez sounds perfect." Tasha smiled.
And I am excited about that. But it's not what I was talking about.
Our baby?
She nodded. And Camille's. It's going to be such fun, both of us being pregnant at the same time. I wonder which one of us will give birth first.
That inquiry had crossed Andre's mind a time or two in the last 15 minutes, and now it was front and center and weighing heavily on Andre's shoulders. If Camille had her baby first, Julian would never let Andre forget it. Chapter 13. Andre headed to the East Rose Garden to wait for Tasha, who'd gone up to change into something more comfortable. Simon had gone to the kitchen to arrange for tea and fig Newtons, Tasha's favorite cookie, to be served to the newlyweds on the terrace. The solitude of the garden and the ambiance of the moonlight promised to subdue Andre's anxiety once Tasha joined him. So what if Julian and Camille's baby was born first? It didn't take away from the fact that Tasha was having his baby. That idea filled Andre's heart with joy. As par for the course with Julian, he and Camille would probably have a boy. Maybe Andre and Tasha's baby would be a girl. The first granddaughter. She would definitely be Claudette's favorite. And seeing the way Papa had softened upon Lacey's arrival, Andre thought it a fair bet that Papa's first granddaughter would easily have him wrapped around her little finger. He heard the door open behind him and looked over his shoulder, expecting to see his beautiful wife. Instead, the sight of his brother deflated the joy swelling in Andre's heart.
"Oh, it's you,"
Andre said, making no attempt to cover his disappointment. He turned back to the rose garden, dimly lit by solar lamps. While the display was not as spectacular as the spring showing, the late summer and early fall blooms were still lovely to behold. And a far better choice than Julian, who'd probably come to gloat.
"Why are you so blue, little brother?"
Julian sat in the chair, kitty-cornered from Andre.
"You should be happy. You have somehow managed to convince the one woman who could actually help you pull this off into marrying you. Well done. I didn't marry Tasha for the sole purpose of the will. I married her because I love her. In case Claudette and Papa didn't tell you."
"Oh, they told me," Julian chuckled, and Andre shot him a warning glare.
"Don't worry."
He shook his head.
"I won't bring up the will or its stipulations in front of Tasha. That would be ill-mannered."
Julian shrugged.
"Besides, I don't want her to leave any more than you do."
He had a point. Tasha's staying was imperative if Julian hoped to inherit his share of Uncle Edouard's estate, 50 million euros.
"There's far more at stake than money."
Above all else, Andre didn't want Tasha or his child to leave. He'd gladly forfeit the money if it guaranteed she'd stay. But the fact remained that he was married now, and he and his wife had a child on the way. Andre needed to do what it took to provide for his family. His children deserved every possible advantage that he could arrange for them, and making sure he inherited what his mother's uncle left him was a good start.
"Yes, but you and I both know that money is power. Money isn't power. You want to know what is power?"
Andre peered at his brother. Once he had his undivided attention, he continued.
"You and I, we can control De Laurent Enterprises, and pretty soon Montclair. But that's just control. It's not power. Not really."
Andre shook his head and clasped his hands together between his knees and stared at them while he tried to wrangle his emotions into submission. Finally, he looked back at his brother, stoic-faced, and said, "Love is power." Andre was afraid that if Tasha found out about the will's stipulations, she'd leave him. She'd go back to America, taking his child with her. He wouldn't know from one day to the next how the child was, if it was all right, or if it missed him.
"Good Lord!" Julian exclaimed. "If this is what getting married does to you, just wait until you have children."
Andre laughed at Julian.
"You really need to catch up, brother."
Julian raised his eyebrows.
Tasha is pregnant.
Andre nodded.
And she's due right around the same time as Camille.
Julian threw his hands into the air.
Oh, can't you give me anything?
There was a pleading quality in Julian's voice now, and it surprised the hell out of Andre. Julian had never begged anybody for anything in his whole life.
Do you have to surpass me in everything now?
What? Andre's mouth fell open.
I've lived every day of my life in your shadow. But it was a safe place, wasn't it?
Julian asked.
Didn't I always take care of you? Yes, you did.
Andre paused, trying to figure out why Julian had this newfound outlook that Andre was the one who was always on top.
But I don't get how I've surpassed you in anything.
Julian hesitated.
Well, I was always taught that I would be the provider for this family. You would help me, of course, but ultimately it was up to me to see that everyone was taken care of. And how has that changed? I'm not in charge anymore, Andre. What are you talking about?
Andre showed his palms and shrugged.
You are and always will be the majority shareholder in De Laurent Enterprises.
Julian snorted and rolled his eyes.
De Laurent Enterprises is child's play compared to Montclair.
Julian cleared his throat.
There was a reason Papa married our mother, besides her beauty. She came from a family of enormous wealth.
Somewhere in the back of his mind, Andre had always known this. Well, at least about the degree of wealth in his mother's family. The yacht she had left Julian, and the villa in Saint-Tropez Andre had inherited from her all spoke to it. That's not to say that Papa didn't have his own money when they married. The De Laurent family had been thriving for generations. But coupling the De Laurent money with Renault wealth had helped to shoot De Laurent Enterprises into the Forbes 500, where it remained to this day.
All that is nothing new, Andre said. But what does it have to do with the here and now? You've bested me.
Julian's choice of words were more likely to be heard in some Paris nightclub than inside the halls of Pacifique des Lumières. Andre crinkled his brow, trying to figure out when he'd managed to outdo his brother at anything, and Julian added,
Montclair could swallow up a little fish like De Laurent Enterprises, and it would never be heard from again.
Andre didn't know why Julian was feeling sorry for himself, but Andre wasn't about to play that game.
That's absolutely ridiculous. No, it's not ridiculous, and you know it too.
Julian cleared his throat and shook his head.
In a year's time, you will have taken my place as head of this family. Well, second to Papa.
Julian rubbed his chin, then spread his palm open as he added,
The first grandchild in the family was all I had left.
He shrugged.
And now, you very well might steal that from me too. You are overreacting.
Andre propped his elbow on the arm of his chair and laid his forehead against the inside of his fingers.
No, I'm not. In a matter of days, Papa's whole world is turned to revolving around you. He keeps saying to me, Did you ask Andre what he thinks?
Julian said in a wavering voice. For the first time in his life, Julian was showing fear, and it made Andre feel guilty.
Look, I never wanted to unseat you,
Andre said in earnest.
I would simply like to carve out my own place in this world. Well, you've done a great job of that, little brother.
Julian's voice had lightened up. Andre snorted.
Yeah, I made the wise choice of being born second.
Julian laughed out loud.
Promise me one thing, Andre asked. What's that? Promise me that we won't pit our children against each other, that we'll teach them to look out for one another, just as you've always done for me. And you have done for Lacey, Julian added. Our children will be fine, baby brother, as long as we don't let Papa influence them too much. Andre and Julian's hearty laughter echoed across the garden as the door behind them opened. Tasha. Finally. Not that Andre didn't like his brother's company, but his wife's was far superior. Both men stood as she sauntered across the terrace. Tasha. Julian took her hand. May I say again, welcome to the family.
Thank you, Julian.
Tasha nodded.
And congratulations. I'm sure you and Camille will be wonderful parents.
Julian chuckled. It was nice to see him smile, especially since he thought Andre was about to usurp his throne. Jim and Nola Gordon arrived at Pacifique des Lumières late Friday morning of the following week. They rested in one of the many guest rooms at the house and then took Tasha and Camille out to dinner in Marseille.
So,
Nola picked at her salad and glanced at Camille from time to time.
Tasha tells me you were expecting too.
With a mouthful of minestrone soup, Camille only nodded and smiled.
And due about the same time?
Nola's gaze lingered on Camille for another second or two before drifting over to her daughter.
You girls are going to have such fun. We're excited,
Tasha said.
It's going to be great fun having babies at the same time.
Camille sucked in a breath.
Oh, I hope this morning sickness thing passes quickly, though. That's not too much fun.
She rolled her eyes and chuckled. You too? Jim asked Camille, then pointed his fork at Tasha. She was pretty sick with it before she and Andre left the States.
I've not been feeling too bad lately,
Tasha shrugged.
France must agree with me. Lucky you, Camille said. I had to get medication for it.
She looked at Tasha.
Did you get set up with a doctor's appointment yet?
Tasha nodded.
A week from Monday. Gives you time for a honeymoon.
Camille giggled.
I think she's already had a honeymoon,
Nola stated. Tasha felt her face burning, but she ignored her mother's jab. She cleared her throat and hoped the embarrassment quickly faded.
So where are you and Andre going for your honeymoon? Camille asked.
Tasha knew Camille was trying to change the subject, and she thanked her for it.
We're going for a little R&R at the house in Saint-Tropez that he inherited from his mother.
Oh. An excited light flashed over Camille's eyes.
Julian has taken me there. It's a gorgeous house, and the view is to die for.
She laughed and added,
I'm jealous. If it's half as beautiful as the house that Lacey's inheriting in California, I'll be thrilled.
A feeling of peace befell Tasha. She hadn't had any morning sickness since arriving in France, and now that she and Andre were married and about to go on their honeymoon after the French ceremony tomorrow, she'd begun to feel like everything was finally going her way. Chapter 14. The wedding was simple, by de Laurent standards. The guest list consisted of less than 20 people. Tasha's gown was elegant, the flowers tasteful, and the dress code was a step or two down from black tie. It's no wonder that the reception was little more than the cocktail hour the de Laurents typically had before dinner, but it made little difference to Andre and Tasha. As far as they were concerned, they were on their way to a wonderful life together, and a fancy wedding mattered little to the outcome. When the time came for Andre and Tasha to depart for the airport, she insisted on tossing her bouquet, even though there were all of 4 single women to vie for the catch. Lacey, as fate would have it, caught Tasha's bouquet. That must have been some kind of sign, since she had caught the bouquet at Camille's wedding, too. At least, Tasha thought it was a sign as she climbed into the limo where her parents were waiting. They were also on their way to the airport, but they were headed back to the States, while Andre and Tasha's destination was Saint-Tropez. Camille stood in the shadow of the covered archway at Pacifique des Lumières' main entrance on the 2nd floor. The car carrying Andre and Tasha and her parents had long since disappeared behind the ancient stone walls and massive pine trees that barricaded the estate. She could hardly wait for Tasha and Andre's return.
They were going to have such fun being pregnant together and having babies at the same time. Their children would not only be cousins, but best friends. Reluctantly, she turned and headed back inside. Maybe she'd go find Julian and talk to him about hiring a decorator to help her with the nursery. Camille strolled down the hallway, meeting Parker, the butler, at the main intersection. "Madame?" Parker stood there, straight-faced, with his hands behind his back. "There is a long-distance telephone call from California. The party, a young lady, is asking for Miss Tasha or Madame."
Oh, thanks, Parker. I'll take care of it.
She headed off into the western corridor. Her destination, the sitting room. She had found it the perfect place to take calls on the house phone. The family rarely spent time in there, so it always afforded silence and privacy. She slipped into the room, easing the door shut behind her. She picked up the receiver and said, "Hello, this is Camille de Laurent."
Camille?
A familiar voice, yet one she couldn't identify, greeted her.
It's Beverly from Electric Avenue. I was looking for Tasha, but they said she's gone off on her honeymoon. Beverly. Hello, how are you?
Camille asked, but didn't wait for an answer.
Yes, Tasha and Andre are on their honeymoon. Great.
Beverly sighed.
Then I take it she's feeling better.
That she is. Did Beverly know about the baby? Camille wasn't sure and decided discretion was the best course of action.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. So many people got sick. Several ended up in the hospital. It was a nasty mess. I know Tasha was one of the first to pick up the bug, so I just had to call to find out if she's okay. She's fine.
A bug? Obviously, Beverly wasn't talking about a pregnancy.
Good.
Beverly sighed again.
I don't think any of you are in danger. The doctor here says that the contagious period is the first few days, and Tasha was sick for several days before she quit the restaurant.
Contagious? Camille hadn't thought of that.
What exactly was it, Beverly? A virus? Oh, some weird stomach flu. I forget what it's called. But really, you should be okay. All right. Thanks for calling. I'll let Tasha know you called when she gets back. I'll make sure she gets in touch.
Camille heard the girl say,
"Thanks,"
as she hung up the phone. A bug? A stomach virus that landed some people in the hospital? This wasn't good.
"What about Tasha's baby?"
she said, barely above a whisper. What about my baby? Maybe Camille should give Dr. Goldman a call. With any luck at all, Beverly was right and Tasha was no longer carrying the bug by the time she had arrived in France. Again, what about Tasha? Zipped through Camille's mind. She'd better call Tasha. She should see a doctor as soon as she and Andre arrived in Saint-Tropez. Perhaps Dr. Goldman could recommend someone. That settled it. Camille would call Dr. Goldman first. Chapter 15. A single word, pregnant, prattled through Cecily Garceau Mason's mind. Not only was Andre de Laurent newly married, but his bride was also with child. Well, that settles it. Conrad crossed the living room and sat down in her husband Daniel's favorite chair. The de Laurents win, again. Cecily's brother had always been the easily swayed type. She'd always known it wouldn't take much to convince him to concede, and once he'd given up, she'd be all alone in the fight. But that didn't deter her. Billions might not be enough to tempt Conrad, but it was all she thought about. Oh, it's not over until the 12th month has ended. She shook her head and went to the window overlooking the gloomy, run-down courtyard of the apartment complex she and Daniel had lived in for the past 10 years. Neither the owners nor the manager cared that the terrace or the apartments were in disrepair. The tenants weren't important enough for them to care about improving the property. Not exactly a slum, but far from the affluent neighborhoods that Cecily coveted. To live amongst the privileged, that's what she wanted. It's what she'd always wanted. And now that the first bona fide opportunity had come to her, she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. Cecily was willing to do just about anything to get that inheritance, and she didn't care who she stepped on in the process. That's what rich people did anyway. They stepped on people to get where they were. She'd accepted that and was fully prepared to climb her way to the top.
The very last second must tick by before I will acknowledge that Andre will inherit instead of us.
Conrad laughed.
You say his name like you know him. I know his kind.
She shot her brother an over-the-shoulder glare.
I know that he and his newly made family is the only thing standing between us and luxurious wealth.
What Cecily really meant was me. But she stood a better chance of dethroning Andre if her brother was standing with her.
Cecily,
Conrad complained, shaking his head.
It was one thing when we thought we were going to expose a fraudulent marriage, but it's obvious that isn't the case. The girl is pregnant. Yes, but is the child Andre's?
Cecily turned away from the window and perched her hands on her hips.
He married her, it must be.
Sometimes Cecily wondered if Conrad was adopted. This was one of those times.
She wouldn't be the first opportunist persuaded by the promise of a hefty payoff.
Then how do you propose we proceed? Conrad said in a defeated voice. At least he gave up as quickly as he gave in.
Well?
She went silent while various scenarios flittered through her mind. Finally, one stuck, and she smiled.
I suppose people like the De Laurents will be looking to hire a nanny. God knows they don't take care of their kids themselves.
A nanny? He paused while it sank in. I hadn't thought of that. Of course he hadn't.
I'm sure they'll want to hire one soon, she said, so they can get to know her before the baby arrives.
As a nurse, Cecily had the credentials, and the sooner she could position herself between Andre and his new wife, the better. Chapter 16. The house in Saint-Tropez, set high on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, reminded Tasha of the house Lacey was to inherit in California, only this one was larger. The master's suite had tall windows that looked like garage doors, but with glass panels framing the walls at the southeastern corner. The windows opened to a wraparound balcony that Tasha thought would be like sleeping outdoors, and since the bedroom was on the second floor, there wasn't much worry of anyone wandering in. Considering the estate's significant security and 9-foot barricading walls, intrusion could hardly be an issue. Tasha had taken Camille's call out on the terrace that was shaded by the master suite's balcony above. A gentle breeze blew past as she listened to Camille relay the conversation she'd had with Beverly.
I'm sure it's nothing, Camille said, but Dr. Goldman thought it might be a good idea if you see Dr. Ainsworth there in Saint-Tropez.
Tasha placed her hand on her belly and tried to swallow the lump clogging her throat.
I'll be sure to do that. Dr. Goldman telephoned the office up there. As soon as you call, the doctor will see you.
Tasha tried to laugh.
I guess it pays to have friends in high places. You're the one in the high place, Tash. You've got De Laurent money backing you now. Remember that. That'll take some getting used to. I hear you. But I'm sure Andre will make the transition as easy on you as Julian has done for me. Yeah.
Tasha sighed.
Andre has a way of making me feel like anything's possible. It's the De Laurent charm,
Camille giggled.
All three of those men are dripping in it, even Maurice, once you get to know him.
Tasha was happy to hear that Maurice had warmed up to Camille. He'd been rough on her when Julian first brought Camille to France. Funny thing, though, Maurice had been cordial to Tasha from the moment he had met her. Maybe because he hadn't seen Tasha as the threat he'd envisioned Camille. Luckily, Maurice had mellowed in the years since Camille and Julian had renewed their vows. Tasha stayed out on the terrace long after she had ended the call with Camille, just sitting there, thinking, hoping, praying the stomach virus hadn't affected the baby. Andre came out onto the terrace, but Tasha hadn't noticed until he spoke.
You finish your call with Camille?
His voice drew her gaze upward to where he was standing beside her.
What'd she have to say? You two comparing pregnancy notes? Andre asked with a chuckle.
Sort of.
Tasha looked away, consumed with the fear of having to tell Andre about the virus. Andre sat down on the coffee table in front of Tasha and reached for her hands.
What is it, mon trésor?
We have to call a Dr. Ainsworth and see him right away. The sooner the better. Dr. Goldman has already told him we'd be calling.
Andre's face twisted into a look of awkward curiosity.
Why do we need to see this doctor right away?
His voice had weakened, but his grip on her hands tightened. Tasha hesitated, searching for the right words.
Remember how I told you I'd been suffering from some pretty nasty morning sickness when you showed up in California?
Once Andre nodded, Tasha continued on.
Well, as it turns out, it might not have been morning sickness. A coworker talked to Camille. She called to inquire after my health after nearly everybody at the restaurant came down with a nasty stomach virus, right around the time you showed up and swept me away.
I take it that if you had this virus instead of morning sickness, it may well have endangered the baby?
All Tasha could do was nod. If she spoke right away, she might cry. After taking a little time to compose herself, she said,
I'm afraid, Andre.
He pulled her to him.
Don't worry. We'll call the doctor here on Saint-Tropez. Whatever happens, we'll get through it together.
It seemed ages ago that Andre and Tasha had been tucked away in an exam room in Dr. Ainsworth's office. The doctor had performed all the routine exams, including an ultrasound. Then he excused himself, saying he'd be right back. Tasha fingered the patient's gown the nurse had given her when she and Andre had first arrived. Andre slipped his hands around Tasha's.
The doctor's not saying much.
Tasha was trying to feign courage, but Andre knew she was frightened. Truth be told, so was he.
What if...
There's no need to muddle things up with what-ifs. What is it you say? We'll worry about that bridge when and if we come to it.
That's easier said than done.
Tasha tried, unsuccessfully, to laugh. Andre brought her hands to his lips and brushed them with kisses.
I hate to see you so bleu, mon trésor.
That rated a genuine smile from Tasha.
You know, I never knew I wanted a child until I found myself knocked up with one.
She let out a half laugh and made eye contact with Andre.
But now that I am, I want this baby more than anything.
Let's wait and see what the doctor says before we start worrying.
Tasha nodded. The door opened and Dr. Ainsworth walked in. His stoic expression gave little away about the status of Tasha's condition. Dr. Ainsworth clasped his hands together and dangled them in front of him. He sucked in a breath and held it briefly before blowing it out with force.
Tasha? Andre?
He looked at each of them as he said their names.
I'm afraid this pregnancy isn't a viable one.
What?
Tasha's emotion-choked voice grated out the word.
This pregnancy isn't a viable one.
The words shuddered through Andre.
Their baby was gone? What does that mean?
Andre wanted very much for the doctor to say they'd misheard him.
There is no heartbeat,
the doctor said in a remorseful tone.
No heartbeat? Well, that settled it then. Our baby is dead.
Andre's heart splintered into pieces. Tasha struggled for breath.
It was the flu, wasn't it? I got the flu last week and it killed the baby.
Her blue eyes brimmed with tears that mingled sorrow and guilt. She blinked, and a single tear spilled from one eye. Tasha's suffering wrapped around Andre and squeezed. The pain in his chest made it all too real. This was his fault. If he had married her and brought her back to France months ago, she would have never caught that damned virus. Dr. Ainsworth shook his head.
No, Tasha. The flu didn't cause the miscarriage. I'm afraid the baby stopped developing weeks ago. I'm surprised your body hasn't already begun the expulsion process. Is that normal? Andre asked, beginning to fear for Tasha's health. It's not uncommon. Dr. Ainsworth shrugged. But it's not unheard of. What's next? Andre asked. Tasha needs to be admitted to hospital for a D&C.
He's wrong. He has to be wrong.
Agitation raked over Tasha's voice. She looked at Andre with pained eyes.
Our baby can't be dead.
When Andre didn't confirm her pleas, she lowered her head and rested her chin upon her chest. Tasha began to whimper. Andre leaned over her, wrapping his arms around her. Intense sobs wrenched Tasha's body. She fought him, bashing her fists about his chest and shoulders. Andre tightened his embrace. His wife had just lost the only thing she'd ever wanted. If it helped her to hit him, then so be it. But sooner or later, Andre had to find a way to help Tasha get past the pain of losing their first child. He knew she'd never get over it, but for her sake she had to get past it. And there was only one way that he could think of that might help. With his arms still around Tasha, Andre looked to the doctor.
Can we have more children? We'll know more after the procedure.
Dr. Ainsworth's words shot through Andre like sharp shards of ice. If Tasha could never have a child, how would she get past that? How would Andre? After the procedure, the doctors had told Tasha she could have more children, but Tasha wanted this baby. She felt more than empty. There was a hole in her heart that no amount of cordial words from well-meaning family and friends could cure. Thank God Andre had taken her back to the house in Saint-Tropez for several weeks before they made the trip back home to Marseille. Tasha had needed the time to pull herself together, to prepare herself for when she came face to face with Camille and her by now bulging belly. To be honest, Tasha was a bit jealous that Camille's pregnancy was a viable one, but she was also happy for her friend's good fortune. If anybody deserved some happiness, it was Camille. Andre had been a wonderfully supportive husband during the hospital stay and the following weeks, staying attentively by Tasha's side at all times. They had cried together more than once, but mostly they simply held on to each other in silence. On the eve before their scheduled return to Marseille, as they were lounging on the same terrace where Tasha had received Camille's phone call, the same phone call that had changed their lives forever, Tasha lifted her head and looked at Andre.
What is it, mon trésor?
He smiled.
Is there something I can get for you?
You're too good to me.
Tasha rested her head back on his chest.
Well, you are my wife.
She looked up at him again.
You sure you're not regretting that move, considering the outcome with the baby and all?
Andre shook his head.
I have but one regret.
Tasha's chest felt heavy.
What's that?
She asked, even though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer.
That I didn't marry you months ago.
Andre winked. Tasha wanted to let out a breath of relief, but experience had taught her to be cautious.
You mean it?
Andre nodded, saying,
I mean it.
He paused for a moment, studying her face intently.
And you? You're not thinking of returning to California, are you?
That almost brought a laugh. Almost.
No, California is the last place I want to be. Unless you're there.
Listen, you and I, we're going to have a wonderful life together. I'll make sure of that. We may or may not have children, but Lord knows we're going to try.
His laughter became infectious, soliciting a chuckle from Tasha.
But I promise you, I'll make sure you never regret marrying me."
"I can well believe that," Tasha said. "And I can promise that I'll always try to be the wife you deserve."
"After we return to Marseille, would you like to go on that cruise I promised you?" Andre asked. "Or do you prefer to rest and regroup at home?"
"You know what I'd really like to do?" Tasha's tone turned serious. "Do you think we could put some kind of memorial in one of the gardens for our little angel? I realize we don't know if it was a boy or a girl." Her words trailed off with her need to cry. She didn't want to cry anymore, but she didn't want to forget her baby either. She'd been thinking about a memorial stone or something along those lines for a while now.
"I think that's a fine idea."
Andre snuggled Tasha closer.
"It will be my top priority once we return home."
Inside the limo rolling up the winding roadway toward Pacifique des Lumières, butterflies began to stir in Tasha's stomach. She was thankful that she had something to look forward to, memorializing her baby, but she wasn't sure how she was going to react when she saw Camille, who was still pregnant. Tasha's best friend turned sister-in-law had to have a noticeable baby bump by now. The calendar had recently turned to November. Thanksgiving was right around the corner. However, the French didn't celebrate the American holiday. That was okay with Tasha. She had nothing to celebrate. Knowing full well how far along Camille was, Tasha quietly counted the months on her fingertips anyway. 4 months. Camille was in her 4th month. By now, she must have a baby bump. As the car approached the house, Tasha held her breath and touched her own now empty belly. "Please," she prayed, "let me be happy for Camille." Everyone was there, waiting in the covered archway. Claudette, Maurice, and Lacey formed the front line. Julian and Camille were standing behind the others, making it hard to see Camille's tummy. The car rolled to a stop and one of the servants stepped up to open the door. Tasha blew out the breath she'd been holding. Andre scrambled from the car, then offered his hand to Tasha. She let him pull her from the vehicle, and once outside, she passed around a gentle smile to the family's front line. Claudette was the first to approach her. "We're so sorry, dear," she whispered, wrapping her arms around Tasha. Maurice gave her a sad smile and then kissed her cheek. A heartfelt display for a man such as Maurice. Lacey had tears in her eyes. She latched on to Tasha, saying nothing, just crying. A surefire way to let loose Tasha's own tears. She'd been crying for so long now that it was a wonder she had any tears left. Julian pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and pulled Tasha away from Lacey's grasp.
"My dear,"
he said, blotting her tears.
"If I could fix this, you know I would. It pangs me to say it, but there are some things that even I can't control."
Julian gave her a playful nudge.
"If it helps, please feel free to hit me."
A bit of a chuckle fell from Tasha's lips and trailed off, smothered by her grief.
"Take him up on it," Andre urged. "Never miss an opportunity to slap my brother around."
Camille pulled Tasha into her arms. Her very noticeable baby bump pressed against Tasha. Jealousy jumped up into Tasha's throat, but she managed to banish it with a hard swallow. Tasha touched Camille's tummy, but couldn't tell if the fluttering was her imagination or the baby actually kicking. Do they kick this early? Tasha hadn't a clue. Suddenly, she couldn't wait to feel the feisty kick of Camille's baby as it grew closer to the due date. She hoped Camille would include her in all her upcoming plans where the baby was concerned.
Do we know if it's a boy or a girl? Tasha lifted her gaze from Camille's tummy up to her eyes. No. Camille shook her head. I asked the doctor not to tell me. I want it to be a surprise. Tasha looked at Julian. I'll bet you know what it is, don't you? A chorus of laughter rippled across the archway. Andre poked a finger at his brother. My wife has your number. Julian grinned and nodded his head sheepishly.
There's nothing wrong with keeping a secret or two from your wife, brother?
Before Tasha could object or inquire about Julian's statement, Camille had latched onto her hand, dragged her up the grand entryway, into and through the house. She didn't stop until they were outside again in the West Gardens. Shouldn't you slow down a bit? Tasha glanced around the patio furniture and claimed the nearest chair. You really should take it easy. We have so much to catch up on. Camille sat in the chair, kitty-cornered from Tasha. And I thought you might like a little privacy. What I'd really like to know is what Julian was talking about back there. Tasha crossed her legs. What did he mean about secrets? Camille gave a dismissive wave. Oh, you know Julian. She giggled and shook her head. He never likes to be put in his place by anyone, especially his younger brother. I wouldn't worry about it. It's just Julian being Julian. Chapter 17. Sometimes Camille could just wring her husband's neck. She planned to give him a proper scolding later. These days, she could get away with it. Once she had the baby, she had a feeling it'd be back to business as usual. Julien de Laurent was capable of arguing every waking minute of his day. Camille suspected that he sometimes got his way because people got tired of listening to him. But right now, she had Tasha to contend with. From here on out, she'd have to choose her words carefully. Not that she'd ever out-and-out lie to Tasha, but nothing good could come from Tasha finding out about the exact details of Edouard Renault's will. Knowing Tasha, her pride would get in the way and she'd up and leave. At that moment, Camille vowed to never let Julien place those kinds of stipulations on her child in order to inherit any part of the de Laurent fortune. The door opened behind them. Camille glanced over her shoulder. Monique had poked her head in. Madame Camille, your appointment is waiting in the West Salon. Very good. Camille nodded. I'll be right there. Monique disappeared and the door closed. Appointment? Tasha asked. It's not about the baby, is it? Because, I want to help you with the nursery and all. Camille shook her head. I wouldn't dream of decorating the nursery without your input. But this isn't about the nursery exactly. Then what, pray tell? Julien is insisting that we hire a nanny. Camille stood. I agreed, under one condition. I get to hire her. Tasha grinned and snorted a devilish laugh. Yeah, make sure she knows who's boss. My goal precisely. Camille headed for the door, but stopped and glanced over her shoulder. You feel like going into town with me tomorrow? I want to look at wallpaper and furniture for the nursery. Sure. Tasha smiled and nodded. Great. It'll be much more fun if you're there. Camille went back inside the house and traversed the halls until she reached the salon where her applicant was waiting. She opened the door and stepped inside. The woman sitting on the couch looked to be in her mid-40s. Good. Camille wanted someone mature, someone who was more settled, patient, and attentive. Some of the younger girls Camille had interviewed had the attention span of a gnat. She could see them now, walking around in a daze, wondering, now where'd I put that baby? As Camille approached her, the woman stood and pulled a single piece of paper from her attaché. Madame de Laurent, I'm so pleased to meet you. She offered the paper, her resume, to Camille. Likewise, thank you. Camille took the resume. Please, have a seat. She gestured to the couch where the woman had been sitting. The woman reclaimed her seat while Camille sat in a nearby chair and began perusing the resume. Cecily Mason. The name sounded a bit on the familiar side, but after a second or two of not being able to place it, Camille chalked it up to déjà vu. And she's a nurse. Now that had to be good. Camille liked the idea of having a nurse at her disposal. Camille lifted her gaze from the resume and settled it on the applicant.
Cecily. Oh, may I call you Cecily?
She waited for the woman's response, a nod, before she continued.
What is your area of practice in the nursing field? I've spent the last 20 years at one hospital or another in Avignon, mostly in the pediatric ward and the newborn nursery.
She fingered the satchel in her lap, but kept her eyes on Camille.
I do so enjoy the children.
So you're presently employed at a hospital?
Camille glanced down at the resume and nodded, seeing the word hospitalier. She looked back at Cecily.
You're okay with leaving the hospital?
Only if I find something in private service.
She paused a moment, perhaps to catch her breath.
I've put in enough service at the hospital to retire. I wouldn't mind taking care of a child or two in a private setting.
She shrugged.
It would slow the pace a bit, which I wouldn't find unpleasant. Might be nice for a change.
I can see how working as a private nanny could feel like a vacation for someone with your background.
They chattered and talked for a long time more. All the while, Camille grilled Cecily, but with the utmost respect, never once making her feel as if she was being judged. Instead, to get a feel for her capabilities, Camille asked her about her work experiences with the children over the years. Above all else, Camille needed to feel like Cecily would be supportive to her and attentive to her baby's needs, and would never, ever mistreat the child when she wasn't around. Cecily had done a fair job of setting Camille's mind at ease after a near 40-minute discussion.
Well, Camille clapped her hands together. I think my curiosity is just about satisfied. Is there anything you'd like to ask me?
Are you expecting a live-in nanny?
Of sorts, yes. We're looking for someone to mainly be on call during the day and an occasional evening here and there, so you would need to live nearby. We have a caretaker's cottage on the estate that we'd prefer the nanny and her family to live in. We'd guarantee that you'd have most weekends off, and at least 4 evenings, probably more, most weeks.
A caretaker's cottage.
Again she paused.
If offered the position, might I see the cottage before making my decision?
Of course.
And there's just the one baby?
Camille nodded and glimpsed down at her tummy.
I don't think it's twins.
Both women laughed.
So employment won't actually start for a while, then?
Cecily asked.
Well,
Camille paused.
We'd like the person we hire to move into the cottage within the month, so we can all get to know one another before the baby comes.
She looked at Cecily.
No offense intended.
None taken.
Cecily shook her head.
Would you like to see the cottage?
Yes, I'd like that. Is it far from the main house?
Camille rose, and Cecily did the same, following Camille to the side door leading outside.
It's about 1/4 of a mile behind the main house.
Camille opened the door and gestured for Cecily to exit first.
We'll take a golf cart down.
She closed the door behind her, then led Cecily through the garden.
As the nanny, you'd be provided with a golf cart, as it's the easiest way to get around the estate. Saves walking, at least.
That's very generous of you.
Cecily remained gracious and reserved, even though she was ready to tear into Camille de Laurent. It wasn't anything in particular that Camille had done, other than getting pregnant at the same time as Andre's wife. And why weren't they both using the same nanny? Why hadn't the agency specified specifically which de Laurent couple would be interviewing Cecily? Wasn't this just perfect? Cecily had been delegated out to the wrong de Laurents. Oh well. She couldn't very well excuse herself from the list of candidates, saying, "Sorry, but I intended to apply to your brother-in-law and his wife." Maybe once they got to know her, Andre and his wife would decide to share the nanny with Camille and her husband. Either way, being nanny to Andre's niece or nephew was better than nothing. At least she'd be living on the estate and was bound to run into Andre's wife. At least Cecily still had several months to figure out how to get rid of her, if she got the job. The cart rolled to a stop at the side entrance of a 2-story house sitting next to a pond. Trees provided ample shading, and flower beds filled with budding fall flowers dotted the yard. The sight took Cecily's breath away. This place was far grander than anything she'd ever lived in, and it was just a caretaker's cottage. Imagine the possibilities if she could manage to snatch the Renault fortune from André de Laurent. That settled it. Cecily had to get this job. Chapter 18. Cecily Mason was hired as Camille and Julian's nanny. By the time Christmas rolled around, Camille and Cecily were old friends. Cecily had heard the whispers among the other servants about the riches that flew around the de Laurent family at Christmas time, and for the first time in her life, she felt no jealousy. Cecily had been given the best Christmas gift of all when she learned about Tasha de Laurent's miscarriage. While she felt a measure of sympathy for the girl, she felt even more hope for herself. With no baby, breaking André and Tasha apart would be easier than ever. She also had a pretty good idea of just how to go about that, too. In the weeks that she'd been at Pacifique des Lumières, the thought had occurred to her more than once that it was a pretty safe bet to say that Tasha de Laurent hadn't a clue about the stipulations of Edouard Renault's will. If Cecily was right, and Tasha found out about it, if she was told in the right way, Tasha could be persuaded that André had married her solely to gain his inheritance. And that's exactly what Cecily intended to do when the time was right. Now was too soon. Considering the will stated that André must be married for 1 year, which meant September, then the perfect time was summer. Anything sooner might give him and the de Laurent attorneys time to find a loophole inviting a second marriage, and Cecily couldn't have that. Waiting until midsummer was the better plan. Tasha's abrupt departure would send André reeling. By the time André collected his thoughts, September would be here and he'd be in the midst of divorce proceedings. Or better yet, Tasha would have the marriage annulled. Either way, the Renault money would be Cecily's. But it all depended on just how much Tasha knew. Cecily was betting very little. She used these next few weeks to find out if she was right, or if she needed to come up with another plan.
"Make sure you bundle up good. It's cold outside,"
André told Tasha in a bubbly tone. She fanned her hands out at her sides. "If I was any more bundled up, you'd have to roll me out of here." André had to admit she was right. With that thick tweed knee-length coat, gloves and scarf over her pantsuit, she looked pretty well padded.
"Good. I don't want you to get cold."
He winked at her and grinned. "What are you up to anyway?" Curiosity twinkled in her eyes as he led her to the door. He draped his arm around her as they strolled along the hallway. "Are we leaving the estate?" she asked.
"Nope."
He shook his head. André had told her very little since she'd awakened this morning, only that he had a surprise for her. She'd been cross-examining him ever since. "You've hidden it on the grounds," she said, as if she had just uncovered some state secret.
"Well, it's not really hidden."
At the door of the east salon, he pulled a deep blue silk scarf from his coat pocket and flapped it in the air.
"For that reason, I'm afraid I'm going to have to blindfold you," he added with a grin.
"Monsieur de Laurent!"
She laughed scandalously and turned her back to him so he could cover her eyes. He tied the scarf loosely around her head and then drew her back into his embrace to lead her through the main salon and out into the east garden.
"Did you hide something for me among the roses?"
she asked, feeling her way through the room.
Sort of."
He paused, opened the French doors. The December chill whipped past them. Tasha shivered.
"This better be good, de Laurent."
"Trust me," he chuckled. "A few moments from now, you are going to reward me for the genius that I am."
He led her to the exterior of the hidden alcove and stopped.
"Can I take off the blindfold now?" she asked.
No,
He shook his head.
you'll have to squeeze through the edges, but you can't scrape that blindfold off, he warned. You have to keep it on.
"I can't help it if it comes off."
She laughed and felt her way between two of the hedges. The bush's prickly stems poked at it, but did a terrible job of tearing off the blindfold. When she emerged on the other side, the scarf was still in place, and she silently cursed it. The bushes rustled, and Andre's hands were on her shoulders an instant later.
Okay,
He began guiding her again.
this way.
She thought he might be leading her toward the center of the grove, toward the goddess statue.
"What's going on here?"
You'll see.
His voice never wavered. He slowed her down before instructing her to
Sit.
"Sit?"
she asked in a weakened tone. Tasha didn't remember there being anything to sit on near the goddess statue.
Sit.
He nudged her down. She used her hands to feel her way. To her surprise, behind her she found what felt like a bench.
"Has there always been a bench here?"
she asked, as if she might be going crazy.
No?
Andre sat down beside her.
Close your eyes.
"I'm already blindfolded,"
she argued.
Close your eyes,
He said, firmer this time.
Okay.
She shifted her stance and shut her eyes tighter. His hands fiddled with the scarf.
No peeking.
She laughed, and the blindfold fell from her head into her lap.
Okay, you can look.
Tasha eased her eyes open, and when they focused on what was in front of her, she gasped. The stone, made of marble, must have been about 3 feet tall and more than a foot wide. A beautiful angel was intricately carved into the left-hand side. 3 rows of verses were inscribed along the stone's face. We thought of you with love today, but that is nothing new. We thought about you yesterday, and days before that, too. Your memory is our keepsake, with which we'll never part. God has you in His keeping. We have you in our hearts. In loving memory of our little angel, we cherish the few precious weeks your mother carried you in her womb. Andre and Tasha's names had been carved at the base of the stone. A tear slipped from each of Tasha's eyes. Her hands flew to her face, and she buried it in them just before her sorrow spilled out. Andre wrapped his arms around her.
I hope it pleases you,
he said, barely above a whisper. She looked at him through tear-hazed eyes.
"Oh, it does. It does."
She swiped at her wet face.
"Do you think we'll ever have the chance to have another baby?"
I certainly hope so.
You know, I've been thinking.
She paused to catch her breath.
Maybe we should start following my ovulation schedule.
Does Dr. Joly think that'll help?
Well, he did say that if we weren't pregnant by Christmas, we could discuss fertility options, and the first one is to follow my ovulation schedule.
Technically, it's not Christmas yet.
He teased her with a wink.
1 week won't matter,
she said with quiet emphasis. Tasha was beginning to think they were doomed to live their entire lives as a childless couple. She didn't know if she could handle that.